Okay, Alexander, we have a lot of stuff going on with the US election, which is still ongoing. Don't listen to what the mainstream media is telling you, and don't listen to Joe Biden's "I am the president-elect" charade. We have the lawsuit in Pennsylvania that was on Kelly, on behalf of Kelly, which Alito was taking a look at, and the Supreme Court was taking a look at. So you'll update us on that. But we had yesterday big breaking news. Texas filed a lawsuit, a state to state lawsuit. And now we have more states which are jumping on board the Texas lawsuit. A total of 7 states. Those states are Louisiana, Arkansas, Alabama, Florida, Kentucky, Mississippi, South Carolina, and South Dakota. 7 states have joined Texas's lawsuit, arguing the Equal Protection Clause has been violated in this election from state to state. This is now on the Supreme Court docket. Alexander, we have a lot of lawsuits flying here. What is going on?
Well, this is, I think, completely predictable. And it's, by the way, a indictment, I'm sorry to put it this way, of the tactics of Chief Justice Roberts, because clearly what he has been trying to do for several months now, since before the election, is to keep the Supreme Court away from having to make these decisions. And we also saw how he has tried, because I have no doubt the influence originally came from him, to try to avoid the request that came from this representative of Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly, to obtain an emergency injunction to stop the Electoral College, the certification of electors for the Electoral College and for the vote of the Electoral College on the 14th of December. Now, the point to understand about this is that the real election in the United States, according to the Constitution, is not the one that happened on the 3rd of November. It is the one which takes place, or is due to take place, or which is supposed to take place on the 14th of December, when the Electoral College meets and decides who it is going to vote for President of the United States. The election which took place on the 3rd of November was an election held by the states to enable them to determine who they should appoint as electors to that electoral college. Now, what Mr. Kelly is saying is that there's lots of controversies at the moment in Pennsylvania specifically, so we need an emergency injunction to prevent this process taking place. And the Supreme Court refused that. It denied that. Now, emergency injunctions are very rarely granted, so in itself that wasn't unusual. But the tactic clearly, or at least someone's tactic, seems to have been to say to themselves, well, we will push this back after the 14th of December, so that the day finally comes when the vote happens, and then we turn around and say, well, we can't actually make a decision because the Electoral College has already voted and the case is now stale. So they haven't rejected Kelly's lawsuit. They've refused his request for an emergency injunction, which in a way was intended to, reject the lawsuit without really rejecting the lawsuit. In Britain, by the way, I think that would be inconceivable. I cannot imagine the Supreme Court of Britain or the Court of Appeal of Britain refusing to hear a case of such importance. Anyway,
Let me stop you there real quick, because that's one part that you're explaining, and I want to just get a tweet from Jenna Ellis, because you've just explained an important part of the Pennsylvania lawsuit that we covered yesterday in a video. So I just want to read you a tweet so you can expand on that before you move on to the bigger and better stuff. So just so we can clarify what happened. So here's a title from Citizen Free Press. This was breaking news yesterday. Supreme Court rejects emergency injunction relief in Pennsylvania appeal from Republicans. And then Jenna Ellis tweeted, after this was going around all the mainstream media, that Trump lost again with regard to Mike Kelly's suit. This is what Jenna Ellis who's on the Trump legal team, tweeted, "Important point reporters are missing in Pennsylvania suit. The Supreme Court only denied emergency injunction relief in the order. It did not deny cert." She abbreviated it. "At Mike Kelly's suit is still pending before the U.S. Supreme Court." And then she gives a link to the Supreme Court website for that case. So go on, Alex. I just wanted to get that in there as you were explaining it.
That is exactly right. So what if you like, the moderate majority led by Roberts in the Supreme Court are trying to do with this case was kick the can down the road, essentially, to the point where they would not have to make a decision. They don't want to make a decision because they're frightened of the Democrats, and they're frightened of all these stories about, the Supreme Court being flooded with new justices if they continue to misbehave. So they're ducking and weaving and trying to avoid a decision. But what's now happened is that their bluff has been called, because we've seen 7 states of the union coming along and saying, we're bringing a case to the Supreme Court because we think there hasn't been the equal voting right rules have been breached, and they're now all coming to the Supreme Court. And I cannot imagine that the Supreme Court will refuse to hear cases brought by 7 states of the union. And of course, over the course of the hearing of that case, the one that the 7 states have brought, I would presume and expect that Mr. Kelly's case is going to be heard also, because there is no sense in leaving one part of this litigation unresolved, which is Mr. Kelly's case, and not looking at the others. So we will have now a major hearing in the Supreme Court, presumably on either Friday or perhaps on Monday. The battleground states, which are the respondents in this litigation, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, all of those, have until Thursday to respond to this suit. But I cannot imagine that the Supreme Court is going to hear suits brought by the attorney generals of 7 states. I mean, that would be unheard of to me. So Roberts's tactic of trying to avoid making a decision, this has always been the worry. His tactic of trying to avoid making a decision, of kicking the can down the road, has failed, because his bluff has, it seems to me, been called. I suppose in theory they could refuse to hear this case as well, though on what ground I cannot see, or they could try to put this case back also. But again, I can't see how that would make any sense at all. And of course, doing that would alienate the very people who are the bedrock of the support of the Supreme Court in the United States, as it is facing increasing challenges from the Democrats. I'm going to say something, by the way. A lot of people noted that the Supreme Court decision to refuse to grant Kelly, or to hear Kelly's request for an emergency injunction, contained no reasons. And that's been construed by some people as evidence that it was, that this was just considered to be an absurd suit, and it was just thrown out for that reason summarily. I think it's much more likely that there is bitter argument going on within the Supreme Court, with people saying to each other, look, we've got to hear this, and Roberts and the justices who've been supporting him trying to refuse any discussion and trying to close this case down. When there is silence, it is usually a sign, to me, of bitter argument rather than of a reasoned decision being made.
All right, so it looks like the stumbling block to all of this is Roberts, a Bush appointee. By no means shall we say it in America first, deplorable type of justice. When I say the word the deplorables, the MAGA type of patriots. So he's definitely a neocon Bush appointee, and he sides, I would say, most of the time with the liberal justices. So you're saying that they're now deadlocked to hear these cases, which may decide the outcome of the election. Kelly's case is still on the docket. It has not been thrown out. Just the emergency injunction has been, just we're not going to deal with it now, but it's still on the docket. The Supreme Court's remaining silent, but we now have all these state-to-state lawsuits, and they're forcing now the Supreme Court's hand to start taking a look at the election fraud and the election irregularities and the election steal. They're forcing the Supreme Court's hands. Roberts, like it or not, you guys are going to have to hear the evidence that we have before you.
Absolutely. And can I just say, for me, it's an absolute no-brainer. I mean, I come back to this. I mean, in Britain, when these cases of constitutional importance come up and when they are being pushed by important parties that, carry political weight, and a state representative is a person who carries political weight. And it is known that the Pennsylvania case that Mr. Kelly was trying to bring, had the backing of the President of the United States and of his legal team, then of course the Supreme Court should hear it. I mean, I think it's extraordinary that they refuse to hear it. With Ted Cruz saying that he's prepared to come along to argue it. And bear in mind, Ted Cruz was a clerk of a Supreme Court justice, I think no less a person than Antonin Scalia said, he's one of the best lawyers I've ever worked with. So you can't just try and say, well, I'm not prepared to listen to these things because if I do, it's going to land me into trouble. Because if you don't hear these cases, then you risk getting yourself in even deeper trouble, because people will then say, well, what are you there for in that case? I mean, the Supreme Court is the guardian of the Constitution. It, by the way, assumed that role for itself under Chief Justice Marshall very soon after the United States was established, after the Constitution was first put into effect. It was controversial at the time, but it has been accepted. So if it sets itself up as the guardian of the Constitution, then it needs to hear cases that go to the root of how the Constitution works. Otherwise, it ceases to be, in any meaningful sense, a Supreme Court. But I have to tell you, I have encountered judges like this, judges who don't want to make a decision, are nervous of being criticized, duck and weave, and are frightened of landing themselves in controversy. And I'm afraid it's increasingly looking to me as if Chief Justice Roberts, who is, by the way, as I understand it, under the American system, the person who bears overall control over the timing of Supreme Court cases, it seems to me that is the line that he is taking.
All right. So finally, we have, as you mentioned, they have to respond to the motion on Thursday, December 10 by 3 p.m. So the Supreme Court has issued a deadline to Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Georgia to respond to the Texas lawsuit charging states with violating the U.S. Constitution with unlawful state elections. Also today, Alexander, Trump has dropped. The Trump campaign lawsuit has now been made available. Has now been made available online, and it consists of a whopping 1,585 pages outlining significant evidence of fraud. Some key points: 2,560 felons voted, 66,247 underage voters, 2,423 votes from people not registered, 1,043 individuals registered at P.O. boxes, and once again, the list goes on and on and on. This is, I mean, it's just a full-on legal assault, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And as I said, the Supreme Court cannot run away. I mean, that's the point to understand. Now, as I understand, I think that is the specific Georgia case, and even Andrew McCarthy at National Review, who, following the line taken by National Review generally, which is a Republican establishment journal, has accepted that this latest Georgia lawsuit has been well put together, is well argued, and is convincing and strong. And to me, it looks exceptionally strong. I would add that, again, and I'm referring now to Andrew McCarthy, he was criticizing Trump lawyers for not, bringing cases with this level of detail and argument. Expecting that this has been the issue for me, I think that's incredibly unfair. Expecting them to put cases of this complexity together in just a few weeks is to demand what most people would say is impossible. It's a miracle that's been achieved to such an extent and so well in Georgia. And I am sure that if you drilled and did the same kind of investigative research in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan, in all sorts of places, Nevada, you would find the same level of evidence. It's always been the problem in this case that there just hasn't been that much time. But as you rightly said, it's all piling in now. So now we have a situation where the states, various states, 7 states, are coming along and saying, we're very concerned. We don't feel that, equal voting rights are being honored. And this stems from the Supreme Court decision, which was the Bush-Gore decision of 2000. So that's the Supreme Court's own decision that's now coming back to them. I mean, a correct decision, by the way, can I just quickly say. And at the same time, this argument that there is actually no fraud is looking increasingly shaky because of the immense detail of this Georgia lawsuit. So all of the pieces are coming into place. The problem always has been time, but what now needs to happen is quite clear to me. Despite the pressure of time, the Supreme Court needs to look at this and make a decision. It's just not good enough for the High Court of the United States, the Supreme Court, also to try to run down the clock. I mean, that is an abdication of its responsibilities. It needs to look at this case of the 7 states. It needs to take cognizance of the fact that there is a case in Georgia now, which is looking a very formidable case indeed. And by the way, we will see what the Attorney General of Georgia says in response to this lawsuit brought by these 7 states, given that I presume that the Attorney General of Georgia is a Republican.
Yeah, we said way in the beginning of this that looking at how the Democrats were handling this, their overall strategy was to get Trump to concede, to shut this whole thing down, to put maximum pressure on Trump and the people around him, to demoralize everybody, the entire MAGA deplorable movement, demoralize them and get them to just concede and rubber stamp this ridiculous Biden presidency. It didn't happen. And we said, if the Trump campaign can not only, of course, get all the wheels in motion and get everything together on multiple state levels, which is a huge task, like you said, but if they can not concede and buy time, as much time as they can, while also working against the clock, it's kind of a weird situation. They needed to buy time, but they also had to be cognizant of the limited time they had. But the more time that they had, that they bought, the more evidence came out. And now it looks like there's multiple paths to getting either Trump reelected or at least putting a stop to this President Biden election process. I don't want to say getting Trump reelected is a guarantee, but at least there seems like there's multiple pathways to stop the wheels in motion, which might put Biden into the White House.
Well, what needs to happen, and I think this is for me a straightforward. I mean, I'm looking at this as an outsider. I mean, I'm not familiar with all the legal and constitutional aspects of this in the United States. I'm not an expert on US legal and constitutional procedure, but I would have thought that the Supreme Court of the United States, which is of course the ultimate high court of the United States, it's a federal court, it, as I understand it, has the similar kind of jurisdiction that the High Court in England has in these kind of cases. I think what it should do is it should accept that there are fundamental concerns about this election. I'm not asking them, I don't expect them to say that there has been fraud, because I accept that would be difficult for them to do, given that the state of the evidence across the entire United States is so much at issue and that this hasn't been investigated properly. But I would have thought that there is still time before the inauguration on the 20th of January for them to issue an injunction instructing the Electoral College to put off making a decision, to postpone the election, in other words, until a proper audit is done. A proper investigation is done, and there is some serious attempt to look at these things. And if, of course, there have been violations of the equal rights laws in various states, well, of course, there will have to be remedies in relation to that also, because it would seem then that the elections in some of these states have simply not been properly conducted at all. But there is still time to sort this all out before the 20th of January. But the Supreme Court needs to use the instruments which it has to hand in order to, use that time productively. And then we will have an election outcome which we can trust. I accept that there will be some people who will, jump up and down and who will be very angry and who will say, that this is all a waste of time and that this is all completely wrong and all those things. And, we could probably see, well, people doing things in the streets and cities of the United States which are against the law. We saw that in the summer. I'm sure things will happen like that again. But the Supreme Court, if it is to function as a Supreme Court, should not be intimidated by those sorts of things. If it lets itself be intimidated, then it ceases to be the Supreme Court. So that is what I think should happen. It seems to me that the way forward is clear. And if, as a result of that audit, and if, as a result of that review of the way in which several states have conducted this election, it is decided, firstly, that the election was tarnished by widespread fraud, and second, that certain states have broken their own constitutions, violated their own laws, and breached the Supreme Court's own decision, which is the law of the United States, about equal voting procedures. And if, as a result of all of that, Donald Trump is inaugurated president of the United States, so be it. That is a legal decision. That is a proper constitutional outcome. And at that point, he is the constitutional president of the United States. And by the way, at that point, it is Joe Biden, not Donald Trump, who should concede.
Absolutely. And one final message that I have is that you now have state legislatures as well, Republican state legislatures that are getting on board. And they're really supporting Trump. I mean, they're really getting behind Trump. So I would say now that we are starting to see a path forward and things are clearing up, and we're starting to see a lot of W's, a lot of wins on the Trump legal campaign strategy, I'm not saying the cases, the strategy. We're starting to see the strategy play out and bear fruit. For God's sakes, the Republican establishment, specifically in the Senate, for God's sakes, you guys, and the governors and the Republican governors in certain states, not all the states, for God's sakes, now is the time to get behind Trump, because now is your chance. And if you get behind Trump, then you also retain the Senate, because a Trump presidency means you will control the Senate no matter what the outcome in Georgia is, with a VP Pence as a tiebreaker. So now is the time for the Republicans, especially in the Senate, especially the McConnells and the Grahams and the Grassleys, to get up off your asses and start supporting Trump, because the path forward is really starting to clear up.
Well, absolutely. Can we just talk about Georgia? Because, of course, what the Republican establishment has been saying is that, Donald Trump needs to concede and support the two Senate candidates in Georgia, because the most important thing is to, retain the Senate for the Republicans. And that means getting these two people elected in Georgia. What that is basically saying is that Trump should disregard evidence of fraud in Georgia. And we now have, I think you said it was an 1,000-page lawsuit in Georgia, which even Andrew McCarthy says looks convincing. 1,500-page lawsuit in Georgia, which is even Andrew McCarthy says looks compelling and convincing. I mean, that is a crazy way of thinking. If there was fraud in Georgia in the presidential election, why shouldn't there be fraud again in the Senate election? There've already been there've already been opinion polls which put the two Democrat candidates ahead in Georgia. We saw how accurate the opinion polls were during the presidential election. And can I say again, the fact that the opinion polls were so inaccurate during the presidential election was not chance. It was intended. It was always intended to create this appearance that Trump couldn't win. So you've got to be, they pose as the realists, the Republican establishment pose as the realists. They are not being realistic in this situation. They are absolutely not being realistic. And what they are seeing is that the Republican Party, up and down the nation, is rebelling against them. Republicans in local houses of representatives, much closer to the electoral base and to the people, are saying, we are not going to support this. We are not going to put up with this. We think there was fraud. We fear there may have been fraud. We're going to fight this. And you see 7 states of the union are fighting it also. And note, by the way, that these establishment Republican media sites, Washington Examiner, National Review, are saying as little about these cases, this case that these 7 states have brought to the Supreme Court as possible, because bluntly, they are very embarrassed, and I think they're getting extremely nervous that the Republican Party, the mass of its members, well, not members, the mass of its supporters, the mass of Republicans out there in the nation are turning against them. They have a tiger by the tail, and they need to understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we will leave it there. Alexander Mercurst, thank you very much, guys.